Morning. Morning. So, I wasn't a Christian my whole life, and so many of you have probably been to some big Christian event type things, but I had never been to anything like that before, and I got invited to go to this thing called Missions Fest. I think they call it something else now, which is a big Portland, Oregon. It was trying to be the hub for all the different missions works of all the churches in Portland, Oregon. And it was the biggest thing that I had ever been to, except for the time that I went to Promise Keepers. It was just massive. And they had all these different great speakers. They had dynamic ministries that were being showcased. They had these wonderful workshops that you could go to for free. And I'd never been to anything that was that big. And so keep in mind that I was a pretty new Christian. I was been a Christian for 2 or 3 years at that point. And I wasn't really up on the lingo of a place like that. I don't know if you've ever been to a different, more modern church, but they have different lingo. Like they don't call a meeting, they call it refocus, something like that. Have you ever been to a place like that? But anyway, I wasn't up on the nomenclature, and so I was looking at the different tracks for different kind of events, because you couldn't go to all of them. It wasn't like yearly meeting maybe or something where you could maybe go to all of them. You couldn't go to all of them. So there's different tracks, and the tracks that looked the most interesting to me, they were called the finisher track. I didn't really think too much about what the word finisher might mean. But when I went to the first class in that track, I realized that I was not the finisher. I was 23 years old, and I was the youngest person in that class. Somebody had to explain to me what it was that they meant by finisher. It turns out that what they called a finisher was someone we might call a retired person, except for that they didn't believe that retirement was really a biblical concept. And so they thought of it as being a finisher, someone who had time and resources maybe to re-up being a missionary for the last couple of years of their life, to use every ounce of influence and time they had left to make a difference for Christ. So I wasn't a finisher, and they kicked me out of the class, and I had to go to a different one. Felt like I wasn't old enough to ride the ride. But that idea of a finisher really stuck with me, the idea behind it, that you would be not just a starter, but a finisher. So Paul is in this place as he's writing from prison, of thinking of himself as a finisher, of being a person who is coming to the end, doesn't know how much time he has left. And he's trying to think about what is the most effective thing he could do for the church, for Christ's cause, with this maybe twilight part of his life. And his life isn't turning out as most people would think a part of their 5-year plan would turn out. Paul's in prison, one of the worst prisons that you could probably imagine. More like a Turkish prison, if you've ever seen like a horrible movie that had something like that. I mean, it was not like a modern prison. Being in a modern prison would probably be like being on vacation compared to where Paul was at. He's writing the letter of the Philippians. And so he's really facing that question of what it's going to mean for him if he doesn't live any longer. If he's in this place where he's going to go to trial, and they might decide that he can go and be with the Philippians once again and serve as a minister and missionary there, or the powers that be might decide that he's better off dead and it's over. He's been kind of a hassle. And so that's where he's at. And according to one of my favorite scholars, a man named N.T. Wright, Paul actually agrees with these powers. He agrees that he would be better off dead. And this, sometimes we might read a passage like this and think that Paul might have some kind of death wish here, that he just wishes that he could just be in heaven right now, and he just wants to die. I don't think that's really what he's talking about, but he is warning the church that he's writing to, that this is a possibility, that it's a strong possibility that he might not ever see them again, but that he's ready to accept that. Paul doesn't really know what the fate is going to be that will befall him. And I think we each in our own way, we find ourselves in places of indecision, places where we don't know what's going to happen, but big things are happening, and we feel like we're torn between making a decision, and we just don't want to get it wrong. Some weighty things are going on, risky things. And we find ourselves in that crossroads where we just don't know which way that we're to go. We don't know what following God will really require of us. And we may not be facing death, as Paul was in his letter, but we come to that place where we just really don't want to get it wrong. We recognize that tomorrow isn't guaranteed for anybody, and we don't want to make more regrets that will come back and haunt us later, if there is a later at all. People today often don't find themselves in this place where they even think like that, like Paul thought when he was there in prison. They don't get to there because they don't ever let themselves get into a risky place of uncertainty where it all depends on God. We kind of control our destinies. We let fear control us, and we would just never let things go that far. We kind of have a plan. We kind of ask God that he would baptize our plan, that he would never take us too far off course of the plan that we have already planned for ourselves. And so for many of us, that we do give God permission to meddle with our lives now and then, but we don't ever say, God, you can completely scrap this plan and rewrite it. You can change it completely and do whatever you want to do with me. Well, for some of us, the crazy ones, as it were, we come to that place where we let God prioritize our lives for us. Something that George Fox, the founder of our denomination, called letting your lives come to a place of gospel order. And we come to that place where we lay down our plans and we take up the plans of God. And some of us never get there because we're so fearful. We never let ourselves come to that place where we would lay down our own will and really seek after God's will. Where we can grasp what it is that Paul really meant as he wrote from prison the words, to live is Christ and to die is gain. I'm not going to sit up here and pretend to you that I know everything about this mystery that Paul describes. I'm a pretty young person, and I just don't know all about the mystery of to live as Christ and to die as gain. But I have had a little bit of experience with that idea that Paul describes. For me, that started to look like me finding my call to ministry. And for you, it might look completely different. God might have a different ministry or some other thing that he calls you to do. But for me, it looked like following Jesus on this crazy whirlwind adventure that I never could have even imagined would lead me here, preaching in front of you of all things. So God might lead you to a place that's beyond something that you could ever imagine. Or on the other hand, he might call you to stay right where you are, but to have a completely different perspective, to see it completely different. Often, I think when we think of the word indifference, we think of a negative word, a negative concept. We think of it as someone who really doesn't care about something one way or the other. And we think of it when someone finds themselves in a situation and they're just kind of apathetic, where they just don't have the energy to care, to decide whether they really like it, or they're for it, or they're against it. The holy indifference, the kind of indifference that Paul has here as he writes to the Philippians is not this sort of thing at all. It's not the detachment of the I don't care sort of attachment variety that we think about. It's the I will let God lead me and not merely choose for myself sort of detachment, a healthy detachment. Paul has come to this place of holy indifference, not because he doesn't care about his life any longer, as we might easily read in the text, but because he has found the freedom of truly wanting what God wants, instead of just making his own path. And I experienced this as I went through my call to ministry, candidating at different churches in Idaho. There were 4 different churches in Idaho, and over the course of 2 years, I kept applying for these churches and going through this weighty discernment process, writing all these essays, traveling to Idaho to preach and meet people and see how things fit. And for me, that was a very frustrating experience because I was always the guy who made it like the runner-up that they went with the other guy. They always went with somebody who was older, wiser, 45 or so, somebody else, somebody completely different from me. Somebody who wouldn't be like, wasn't a heroin addict and had all these crazy stories that you've been suffering through for the last almost 2 years now. And so eventually I found myself quite broken by my experience, trusting God, of hoping and praying and waiting and venting my frustrations at God because He didn't lead me to the place that I thought I was supposed to go. I just wanted to be doing the work of ministry, and there were 4 different times I heard the no. And the last one was really, really hard. The church was very disorganized. I waited almost the better part of a year to hear that no. And it was just really hard for me. But then I came to this place where I heard 2 yeses. It was a completely different situation. And what I didn't expect through this process was that God would show me that I was still getting in the way, that I was still getting in the way of the process of discerning God's will. But I still had some big lessons to learn about trusting God. After hearing 4 no's, I was suddenly surprised by these 2 yeses, and suddenly I had to go back to the drawing board because I thought God was going to make it really, really easy for me to find my place. I thought it was going to be a no-brainer. But all this experience, especially the last one, put me in that place of holy indifference where I could open my hands and just let God put in my hands what it is that He wanted. Put me in touch with the freedom of wanting what God wants that Paul is describing in this passage. Because when you want what God wants, and say the search committee of the church wants what God wants, and obviously God wants what God wants, you find yourself in this place where you're really free to listen and be led and to follow after the Lord. And even if the answer isn't what you were hoping for, and that has often been my experience, even when you find yourself doubting whether God's timing is really that good for you, you begin to trust the process of discernment, even when it's infuriating, even when you feel like you find yourself waiting most of a year or even longer to hear that no that you didn't want to hear. And truly seeking God's will with others, if the answer is no, it's like a clear no from Jesus. If it's yes, it's like a clear yes from Jesus. And I finally had myself in this place where there were 2 yeses, and I came to that place where I really believed that God gave me these 2 paths and I could choose freely which one I was called to go. It wasn't a choice between what I wanted anymore. It was a choice between 2 things that God had for me. And that is really the whole key of holy indifference. Ignatius of Loyola was this 16th century mystic who coined the phrase holy indifference. It's meant a whole lot to me. And he believed that whether you were rich or poor, or that you had health or sickness, that all of these things should be eyed through the idea of indifference. That we can't control them, and so we shouldn't focus on them. We shouldn't be defined by them. We shouldn't let them define us. And something might translate this phrase today into our vernacular as something like a serene acceptance. We just accept peacefully God's will for us. Take it as it is and just run with it. And so according to Ignatius, we should be detached in a healthy way, differentiated if you use psychological language of today, where we don't let things control and define us, but where we get our identity solely from Christ, where we see things just as Paul did when he says, to live is Christ, where we live into that idea that we get our identity from Christ and not from the circumstances that we find ourselves in. We come to that place where our freedom is bigger than our fate, where we have matured long enough in the Christian life that these things affect us, but they don't define us anymore. I have named this sermon series through Philippians that I've really enjoyed so far as Joy from Jail. And I talked a little bit about how the joy of Paul comes through in his letter in ways that we can't even imagine. You think about the kind of prison that he was in. It's just so surprising that he comes out with all this joy, all this talk of joy that runs through his whole letter. But this doesn't mean that Paul wasn't emotionally affected by his circumstances. I want to read for you a little bit of 2 Corinthians. It's another one of Paul's letters. And he's looking back on this time where he's in prison, and this is what he writes. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us, as you help us by your prayers. Then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor granted us in answer to the prayers of many. So obviously, even though all this joy comes through Paul's letter, this was a hard and difficult time for him. A time that affected him emotionally, but it didn't control him. It didn't shape his identity and take that away from him. It didn't take away the fruit of the Spirit that is joy that he experienced even in this kind of desperate circumstances. So just because Paul's belief never wavered, it doesn't mean that his feelings never wavered. He may have been losing his mind from time to time, kind of like I was as I went through that discernment process, or other times in my life when we went through trials, family struggles with cancer, or various things. He came to that place where he never wavered in his identity, but not necessarily in his faith in God. He accepted God's will and God's sovereignty in spite of his circumstances. He accepted the hardships of following God's will, of waiting on God's timing. He accepted the freedom of wanting what God wants. I think there's opportunity for each of us, no matter who we are or where we are, in what stage of life that we're in, where we experience this sort of thing. We experience how these sort of things look in our life. When Liz and I started dating, just before we started dating, we went on this wonderful bike ride. And at this beautiful park, it was a great experience. It was kind of like pre-dating, and we just had a lot of fun. And we were excited about doing something similar again. And so we set a date. I forget what it was we were going to do next. And you know what? Liz stood me up. And then she didn't answer my phone calls. And it was just a surprise because I hadn't done much dating since I'd become a Christian, gone through my divorce and stuff, but just didn't seem like she was the kind of person who was going to do that sort of a thing. Well, it turns out that Liz had a very good reason for not returning my phone calls and standing me up that day. To make a long story short, her parents were away, and her insulin pump had a malfunction, and it wasn't delivering the insulin that it was supposed to. It didn't tell her that it wasn't delivering the insulin that it was supposed to. And she went into an 8-day diabetic coma just before we started dating. But one of the first things she said when she woke up was, "Call James." So, you know, must have made something of an impression. So anyway, I found out that Liz might die. That about her, I started to pray for her. I started to think about her. And I came to that place of holy acceptance, the other side of what Paul is talking about. When I realized that for her, to die would actually be gain. You know, most surprisingly, I found myself in this place of serene acceptance of whatever God would do with the situation that was so outside of my control. And as horrible as it was to go through that experience, I admit, it really set the tone for our marriage, because I basically released Liz's life over to God before we even became had a relationship. I basically gave her up, and God gave her back. And so every moment that I have with her is a gift from God that I could not have had if God had decided something else that day. And so every moment I have with her is a moment that I'm profoundly grateful for. And I think sometimes when we come to that place where we find ourselves laying everything down and letting God pick up the pieces, you know, letting God put what He has for us back in our hands. You know, of finding that place where we let God show us what He wants, how He wants to be exalted, as He was showing Paul that day in prison. The place of letting Him show us the pathway to fruitful labor. And as we accept God's will, to simply accept the gift that is the time that we have left. Sure, it would be better if Jesus came back today and ended all the struggles in our world. It would be better if He called us home to be with Him. That would be better. But there seems to be some kind of work that needs to be done here. some kind of work that God wants to accomplish here that means that we are going to be here for a while. We are going to stay, and we're going to do this work together until it is finished and Jesus decides to call us home. But before we can accept this work and come to that place of holy indifference, we have to learn to trust God, to live our lives with open hands. Let him take what he wants and put what he wants in there. We can't change the past, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty in the future. All we really have is now. We can't fall into that popular trap of just holding on to our own plans until we're done with our bucket list or whatever, and then we're going to let God have a chance to work in our life. It just doesn't work that way. But we will have to ask God for the courage to unflinchingly look at our lives just as they are, and take it as it is, not as we would want it to be. To accept it, a spirit of holy indifference, and live as a people who approach God with open hands, not only about trivial things, but about big things, about even life or death things, like Paul did. And let God give us the eyes to see how we can make the most of the time that we have left, to be finishers, to be people who keep our eyes on the prize all the way till the end. So as we go into our time of open worship, I want you to wrestle with that idea. What it means to be a finisher, what it means to have God take away like the chaff of our lives and give us what it is that he has for us. As friends, we believe that God is still speaking, and at times he might speak through you. And so if you feel led to speak, please stand on the microphone in front of you. And please use the microphone. There are plenty of people who won't be able to hear you, especially over that air conditioner, if you don't decide to wait.